Okay, so in today's video, we're going to talk about OpenGate and why everybody has gone so crazy about this feature. And I promise it's not just because of marketing slop from Lumix because they released 3 new cameras this year. Or maybe I am talking about that, but well, we'll get there. Now, first things first, what exactly is OpenGate? Now, OpenGate doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be the same aspect ratio, but it does refer to using the full width and height of your sensor in order to create creative options that are available to you. Now, when working with your camera sensor, you're going to get something like a 16:9 aspect ratio or a 17:9 aspect ratio, which is commonly accepted in social media platforms, for example, YouTube, or if you make horizontal posts on Instagram or use Vimeo, and even on your television, depending on the show that you're watching. Now, what's interesting about that is watching in 16:9 doesn't mean your camera sensor is 16:9 or 17:9. For example, just give me a second here. This is my Sony a7C II, and if you have a look at here, you'll probably notice that I should probably clean that sensor. But if you look at it here, this isn't actually a 16:9 aspect ratio if you do the measurements. It's actually 3:2. Now, because camera companies might be holding out on you, maybe it's a processor thing, 16:9 is widely acceptable and also a lot of times the only aspect ratio shooting mode that you can get out of your camera, or 17:9, which is a little bit more. Now, the difference between those two, and I'll put those on the screen, is your ability to be able to create creative options. If I have more height of my sensor, I'm going to be able to crop and move around my image if I am fixing it to a 16:9 frame. And also, if I want to reframe things, which we'll talk about a little bit later, depending on the aspect ratio you want to use, using OpenGate is going to give you more sensor real estate, more capture real estate in order for you to reframe things around. However, if you're fine on 16:9 and composing for that and you don't necessarily need the extra room to move things around, you can just continue to use your camera. However, the fact is that Lumix has released new cameras that give you the option for OpenGate, and also they're still competitively priced, which we'll talk about a little bit later, but that's probably the reason why everybody is losing their minds. Also, just so we make sure that we're accurate here, OpenGate doesn't necessarily refer to a 3:2 aspect ratio, but it does refer to being able to use the entire width and height of your sensor. For example, Red cameras aren't 3:2 sensors. I think they're around 17:9, which means if you're shooting OpenGate, technically you are shooting that OpenGate at 17:9. Whereas Lumix cameras, Blackmagic cameras, Sony cameras, and almost every other camera, they're pretty much using 3:2s. But the aspect ratios they make available to you, well, it varies. Lumix have 3:2 OpenGate, and so does Blackmagic, and so do some Fuji cameras too. Okay, so now that we talked about 3:2 OpenGate using the full stuff on your sensor, let's talk about some other aspect ratios and where they're commonly used. I'm going to say commonly used because not every single aspect ratio is specifically dogmatically for that particular purpose. You can use 3:2 to shoot a YouTube video. I've done it a couple times. Heck, this A-roll probably in 3:2 as well. However, 3:2 is usually an aspect ratio made for photography. That way, if photographers wanted to crop in their photos to make it whatever they wanted to for particular types of prints, that was the aspect ratio that you would go with. It also was an aspect ratio for film as well. I actually think that televisions were actually a little bit more of a square aspect ratio. I don't know if it was 3:2 exactly. However, for photography, that's usually what 3:2 is made for and what it was reserved for, and as well as film, depending on the film that you're using. Now, 16:9 is actually going to be used for modern day televisions, which is going to give you that widescreen aspect ratio. You could also use 2:1 or 2:3:1. There's a bunch of other stuff. We're going to go with 16:9. That's going to be what we would call your horizontal aspect ratio, the thing that Instagram wouldn't give us for a really long time, or at the very least, they kind of throttled your reach in order for you to put these 16:9 videos on there. But they work just fine on YouTube as it does use a 16:9 aspect ratio. There's other platforms that do it too, like Vimeo. I think Facebook does it as well, depending on what you upload. But generally for online content and modern day television, 16:9 is going to be an aspect ratio that's pretty common. 17:9 is what some people would call DCI, or a cinematic aspect ratio. I'm not going to go into the weeds in terms of what cinematic actually means, but if you're watching movies, you're in a theater, you might see a 17:9 aspect ratio. In fact, you might even see it on YouTube as well, because we like to shoot cinematically. I'll be so real with you, when I have 17:9, I crop it into 16:9 anyways, but that is going to be another aspect ratio that you can use. The last one, or kind of part of the other common ones, is going to be 1:1 and 4:3. Now, this one's going to be a little bit interesting because I use 3:2 to do this, but it's called the anamorphic aspect ratio, at least according to ChatGPT when I was researching this video. Essentially, if you want to shoot anamorphic, what it does is the lens creates an optical thingy where it stretches out your footage, where you can de-stretch it and get more information on the width of the image, while at the same time still keeping some of that depth of field and that kind of look, that sauce, out of the focal range you're using. For example, example, if I'm shooting at 50 millimeters, right now I'm at 18, I probably look fabulous. If I'm shooting at 50 millimeters on a 16:9 sensor, you're gonna get a limited amount of space on the sides of your image or even on the top and the bottom. Now, if I'm shooting anamorphic, you're gonna have to de-stretch it by whatever the de-stretch factor is, which gives you a little bit more on the sides, but at the same time keeps that 50 millimeter look, or that depth of field, which is kind of defined by the distance of your subject and the focal length and all the other stuff. We're talking aspect ratios today, but what I want to say is that 4:3 and 1:1 is going to be useful for anamorphic footage. However, given the new Lumix releases and other cameras that can shoot in 3:2, you're going to get a lot of screen real estate out of using 3:2. However, there is an argument for 4:3 when using a 2x anamorphic, which is an anamorphic lens type that I don't currently have. So I'm going to play somebody else's video, my friend Connor, who actually explains this a little bit better.
And additionally, something new that's coming to the S12 is a 4:3 mode, which is perfect for 2x anamorphics like this one. This is the Blazer Kato. There we go. I take off the cap for you guys. Blazer Kato 2x anamorphic. Because it's a 2x, it's such a large stretch. Using the 4:3 mode, you're losing a little bit on the left and right of your frame, but that's okay because that's kind of gonna get cut out in post anyway. Also, if you're using the Blazer 1.5x anamorphics in the 4:3 mode, you get a 2:1 aspect ratio, which is what I actually upload to YouTube most of the time.
Okay, that's enough out of Connor. Let's keep moving on. Now, if I haven't explained to you the benefits of anamorphic aspect ratios or 3:2 or just using OpenGate in general, here are some benefits. And mostly one of them is going to be is that if you don't know what you want to shoot for, or there's multiple things you need to shoot for, you can always crop in, especially if that OpenGate is going to be a higher resolution. Now, there are certain cameras that can shoot in 3:2 OpenGate at higher resolutions like 6K, like the Blackmagic Pixis. Again, all of the new Lumix offerings, I believe the Sony XM5, I think the XH2S, and a couple of other cameras as well. Essentially, what's going to end up happening is that using a 3:2 aspect ratio and also being able to crop in because you're using a 6K higher resolution means that if you're working on client jobs where some people might ask you to shoot in vertical and horizontal at the same time, you're actually going to save yourself a lot of time. And also, I think technically make yourself more money. Now, for example, if you've ever seen a Blue Star Nutraceuticals ad on Facebook or on Instagram, or even if you've watched their YouTube channel, which I'll link over here, I've been shooting with them for a couple of years, and oftentimes we have to shoot things for the 16:9 aspect ratio, 1:1, and 4:5, all in one shot. Also, we need to get 9:16 too, which becomes a bit more complicated. And when I was using my 16:9 native sensors, what would end up happening is we need wider lenses, which sometimes doesn't work with the teleprompter, and then move backwards. There'd be a bunch of things you needed to do in order to make it work. You can make it work on a 16:9 sensor, but once we kind of switched over to shooting OpenGate, we're going to be able to get a lot more shots for a variety of different aspect ratios without having to take the shot more than once, which means that time is money, and I could actually get paid to actually make more deliverables, so it actually ends up making you a little bit of money depending on your workflow.
And not a video will go by in 2025 without having Uncle Kofi teaching you the Ghanaian language of the day. So today we are going to talk about being very happy because today we have some good weather. Today is sunny. Today we do not have snow. We do not have cold. We do not have the winter jackets or anything. Me and my nephew, we can go and shoot video. And now I can talk to you about the word. It's going to be Anije. Anije. Now, Anije is going to mean happiness. So if you are feeling good today, you will be Anije. So you can leave a good comment. You can be Anije and you can leave a comment down below. And then that way, I will know that you want to see videos just like this one. I also want to say, if you want to pick up any of the camera we talk about today, I will leave the links in the description down below. But I will also give a shout out, a little recognition to B&H Photo. B&H Photo, if you are someone in America, if maybe you're even in Canada, maybe you can be somewhere where B&H can ship to you. I will leave the link in the description down below. That's where you can get anything from the camera, the lens, any light. You have to get anything from there. You can go to B&H and you can go and get those things in the links down below. There are very many things we have talked about today, so I will leave those things for you to go find out. Let's get back to the video.
For example, if I have a 3:2 sensor right here, say for example, I want to make this video, this particular part of the video, and I want to make it an Instagram reel. Now, I might want to move a little bit farther away from the lens, maybe like back here. That might be fine. But what I can do is I could put this as a 3:2 in this video just to be annoying, but I could crop it to a 16:9 if I want to. And if I want to make this something vertical for YouTube Shorts or Instagram Reels, I could do that as well. And I hope I gave you an example of all three of those. And if I didn't, I'm going to yell at whoever's editing this video, who is probably my girlfriend, and I probably shouldn't do that. What's also fun is you could use different aspect ratios in different situations. I don't know if you guys have seen Sinners yet, but I'm gonna spoil it for you. Kind of a little bit, except for Ryan Coogler kind of spoiled it for himself. But there was a variety of different aspect ratios, even when you were watching it on the IMAX, which like 15 of us can do because who has an IMAX theater locally? I found out that there's a couple local ones. Sorry about that. But to be able to use different aspect ratios also can give you some creative choices in terms of using the aspect ratios to help you with your storytelling. If you want to make something feel like it's a bit more of a vintage vibe, you could shoot in that 4:3 aspect ratios, as TVs were kind of more square-ish and they weren't necessarily rectangles that we have on our televisions today. So if you want to reference something like that for your visual storytelling, that absolutely can be used as a device. And shooting in 3:2 open gate gives you the ability to do that and not lose resolution. Okay, I figured I would mention this part. This is a little bit tricky. I'll probably explain this in another video when we're talking about anamorphics and aspect ratios. Right now, I'm still talking about OpenGate, but this is what it's going to look like when you have an anamorphic file. You're still shooting in 3:2. You still have all that resolution, but you still need to de-squeeze your footage. Now, once you've done that, you will actually have a 2.25:1 aspect ratio. A little bit different than 3:2, but you are going to get a lot more screen real estate versus having to use a native 16:9 sensor. One thing I wanted to point out is as you crop or if you de-stretch footage, you could change your usable aspect ratio. That 3:2 is useful, however, you probably don't want to leave it that way. Now you're still going to get all of that screen real estate. I still recommend shooting in 3:2. If you use 16:9, we already showed you're going to get a lot less information. However, if you do want to find out aspect ratios based on your lens and squeeze factor, you can use this calculator here, and I'll leave a link in the description down below. In fact, just a couple of days ago, I was camera operating on the Ronin 4D, and we actually had to shoot for a 6:5 aspect ratio, mostly because it was more of a horror film, and it kind of had that vibe to it. It was a little bit more vintage, it was a bit more gritty, so we went with that aspect ratio. Now, I wasn't the DP there, I was just kind of doing my job, so I did make some of those crop lines on my image in order to make sure that I'm framing up and composing for a 6:5 ratio. In fact, there are some cameras that make this job in terms of reframing for storytelling a little bit easier. And we're gonna go to the famous S9 in order to explain that. All you have to do is go to your menu, go to frame marker, and you can choose up to 3 aspect ratios that you can use. On top of that, you can not only mask out the stuff that you don't need, but you can also adjust the size and the positioning of those frame masks, so that way you can use that 6K resolution, but you can cut it down for different social media platforms. For example, if you need a 9:16 for an Instagram reel, but you also need a YouTube video in 16:9, or maybe you're somebody on Facebook that needs a 4:5 or a 1:1, I don't know what they're using nowadays, but you can do that all with one clip without having to do any retakes. Basically what I'm trying to say is you could still use more than one aspect ratio in a particular video deliverable. Your final aspect ratio in your entire film will be one thing, but you could crop and change and flip and reverse things as you want to in order to make OpenGate work for you. Now, in terms of your workflow and framing up for different aspect ratios while you're using OpenGate, you want to use something called frame markers or frame guides. Now, some cameras have this internally, like I just showed you, but other monitors will have it as well. Way back in the day, one of the things I loved about my Atomos Ninja 5 was the ability to use frame guides. This is something that I did while I was using the FX line, the FX3, and the FX6 in order to crop for vertical and horizontal footage. You can do that and find that in your monitors, and you could do a little bit of research when you're buying your next camera monitor to make sure that it does have frame guides in it. It's going to be a lifesaver, especially if you want to make sure that you're getting the proper composition that you need for that aspect ratio, so that's something to make sure that you keep in mind as well. I also like shooting a little bit on the wider end of things, especially if I'm going to be shooting in OpenGate and cropping in a little bit later. Now, it's not as much as a difference as shooting in 16:9 because we are working with a higher resolution and a little bit more real estate on the sensor, but one thing that if I'm shooting maybe a 24mm and there's a 20 laying around or a 21, I might go for that just to give me a little bit more to make sure that I'm cropping effectively. A lot of the things when you're working with OpenGate should be able to help you instead of hurt you. And essentially what I mean is you should get a little bit more room to move things around in, or if you want to leave it natively, we already talked about that stuff already. You could be the next Ryan Coogler if you want to. I wish I could, and I know that I can't. Now, some people might like this and some people might not, but there's also a couple of benefits of cameras that are currently able to do OpenGate as well. For the most part, a lot of the cameras that can do 3:2 OpenGate in their category are some of the cheaper ones available. For example, we're gonna reference Lumix again, where a lot of their hybrid cameras are cheaper than other things in their type of category around in the market. We already talked about the S12 being cheaper than the FX3. We're not doing this again, and if it's cheaper now, whatever. You already heard me say that already. Also, if you're looking at any of the Blackmagic cameras, in terms of your larger production camera, the Ursa Cine 12K is a reasonable price compared to other things that are available that can do the same thing. but this one could also shoot in open gate as well. The Pixis that came out just a year ago, also capable of doing open gate. The 6K full frame also can do open gate. The Pixis 12K that's coming out also can do open gate. And relative to other cameras in the same category, well, it's cheaper. Even the Fujifilm X-M5, which I believe has open gate as well, but it might not be 3x2. I could be wrong. It could still do open gate, and it's like $800, which is one of the cheaper cameras around that can do open gate and also have like log profiles and other video features in it. Also, I believe the X-H2S, the Fuji GFX 100 Mark II, which I think is the only like super expensive camera in the category that has open. What I'm trying to say is a bunch of open gate cameras relative to other cameras in their category are particularly cheaper or around the same price, which is nice because if open gate's going to be important to you, well, you could spend the same, if not a little bit less money. It's kind of a plus. Also, I made reference to this already, but I'm going to say it again just so we're on the same page. Yes, you can shoot spherical and anamorphic in a 3x2 aspect ratio. Just if you're using anamorphic lenses and you're de-squeezing the footage, you're going to get a little bit more information in your image in comparison to using on a 16:9, which I've actually compared into this video over here, so I want you guys to go and check that out. It talks about spherical lenses versus anamorphic, but while you're shooting a 3x2 open gate, especially the ones that could shoot 6K, which I think actually currently all of them that shoot 3x2 open gate are 6K. Well, that's a plus there too. Open gate will also give you a little bit more resolution. So if you're looking for a little bit more resolution to crop things in, to reframe your image, we've already beaten this thing like a dead horse. But generally speaking, the open gate cameras available, they do it in 6K resolution. It's kind of cool. Now, all that glitters isn't Burkina Faso gold, but what I can say is there's a couple of drawbacks to having open gate, or if you consider these things drawbacks. Now, for one, I could say that if you are going to use open gate on a lot of these cameras that are available, your readout speed is going to be a little bit slower relative to cameras that shoot 16:9 if you're shooting in that 3x2 open gate mode, or in 4x3 open gate, which I forgot to mention is available on some of the GH cameras. Now, the reason why this is because your camera's processor is reading out more information naturally. It's reading from the full top to the full bottom of your sensor rather than reading the 16:9 portion of that sensor, which means that some of that readout's going to be a little bit slower. Now, in terms of the cameras that can do it quite acceptably, I would say probably the Ursa Cine 12K, the Pixis 12K. I don't know too much about the Fuji X-M5 or the X-H2S, and the S1II, not necessarily the S1R2, as Gerald Dunn's already covered what some of the readouts are in open gate 6K while you're using it on that thing, and they're not particularly fast. And there's also one other drawback when using open gate in 3x2 is that you're going to have limited frame rates. There's not a lot of cameras that can do slow motion open gate, let alone ones that can do them at super high frame rates. The only one that I currently know that can go more than 60 frames a second is the Ursa Cine 12K, and not everybody wants to spend that kind of money in order to get a camera that shoots in open gate. I'll still say it's cheaper than an Ari or a Red though. Basically what I'm trying to say is that in conjunction with that kind of slower readout you get because you're reading the full sensor, doing that at a higher frame rate more times per second probably might be unfeasible for a lot of cameras, lest it might just blow up if you do it for too long. Now, certain cameras can do that at lower resolutions. For example, the S1II could shoot up to 6K open gate, but that's not higher than the 60 frames a second that I mentioned before. It's possible on some cameras, but it's not possible on the majority of them. Which means that if you need to shoot in some buttery, creamy, slow motion B-roll goodness, but you want to do it in 3x2, you're going to have to wait till a new camera comes out. Maybe that FX3 II everyone keeps talking about. Who knows? That being said, I hope I gave you some explanation as to open gate and the reason why everybody is going crazy for this new camera feature, which is also kind of fun because it's not a new camera feature. It's existed for a little bit, but now more cameras are getting it and they don't cost you an arm and a leg. Now I have to sit down and do this video for 40 minutes while my AC doesn't work. It's currently 87 degrees in this room. So if I could bug you to like, comment, subscribe on this video, leave a comment down below if you are shooting in 16:9, 17:9, 3x2 open gate, 1x1, 4x5, or any other aspect ratio that you like is your favorite. And I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.